Hello there. We're going big this time as I have a full-length sword, and as you've seen, most of my collection are smaller antique weapons. So this one I couldn't resist. I actually have two of them, but we're going to look at the better example of the two. Bottom is a pair. This is a Spanish 1907 cavalry sword called a Puerto Seguro, the exact model. And this is the last combat sword issued to Spanish Armed Forces cavalry. So I think that's pretty neat. It was designed in 1907, and that year is actually in its official name, but it didn't hit the field until like 1918 and beyond. So this got used by Spanish forces in the north of Africa and by both sides during the very bloody and long Spanish Civil War. This particular one has a few nicks in the blade, and it's in great shape, but all around it looks like it was definitely used and, not just carried and never removed from its scabbard. So as you can tell, we're looking at the handle here. Let's try to get a better view of it. This is a really elegant design. I love it. So there you go. Now, you can see a couple of distinctive features. The kind of sweeping basket, right, guard. That's great. And also very functional because it's going to cover your hand a lot. Back in the old days, like medieval times and that kind of thing, Spain was a renowned producer of swords, and they were big on designing like full protection for the hand, which I think is a very good idea. So you can see that that tradition continued here. The other distinctive feature here is the handle. You see that kind of checkerboard crisscross pattern of wood. That's a classic Spanish handle of the time. And you can see how big this thing is. I'm of Spanish descent. I'm Latino. I'm probably about the same size as the guys that use this, and it's really surprising that the handle is that large. Most of the time when you pick up an older weapon, it's, if anything, on the small side. So here's a great view of the guard. Isn't that beautiful? And there's the coat of arms, as you can see. The bluing on the metal is still there to a large extent, which I think looks great. I don't know what process they use to do that, but the colors and the detail on the coat of arms and the guard overall, I think are still really beautiful. And from this view, you can definitely see how much hand protection is afforded here. Right, this thing gives you about as much protection as possible. Now let's look at the sheath and some of the details there. We'll bring this guy out in a second, the actual blade. But you can see the screws at both ends there, right? Top and bottom. And you can notice there's like a leather divider between the actual, right there, between the actual sheath and the guard. So they put a lot of work into that guard. It's gorgeous, so they wanted to make sure it didn't get scuffed up every time you put the sword back in. And that's the original leather, and you can see the loop there. There's one vestige of it still left, so I was happy to have that. And again, I just think it's a really aesthetically pleasing weapon. Spanish swords, like I said, were famous back in the day and for a long time. I think this is a good example, even though it's in modernity. Now, the sheath is pretty simple. As you can see, it's got that blued finish, a little bit of a decorative flourish there at the very end, but that's about it. This was a military weapon, so it's not something you walked around with just to impress people, so I think it's elegant, but at the same time simple. And here's the blade, just in great shape. There's a nice bit of evidence about how much this got used right there. You might notice, I'm trying to put the light directly on it, there's something stamped into the metal, but it's been rubbed almost entirely out. So that indicates right there that this, was drawn and replaced many, many times. It's really hard to see, but from what I could tell, it said Toledo, so that's a city in Spain that was one of the old world, one of the most famous old world centers for sword making. So again, I think that's really cool. There's a nick in the blade right there. I'm trying to show you that with the light as much as I can. There's that stamp again, if you can see it. And this is the fuller, for those not too familiar with sword terminology. That kind of trench that runs all the way along is a fuller. There's more nicks in the blade right up there. And fuller is a way to subtract weight from the blade while not sacrificing strength, right? Which is going to matter because arm fatigue is definitely going to count. You can see this is like a long triangular blade, and right, the point and the overall shape definitely indicates this is a thrusting sword. And that makes sense. At this time in history, cavalry sabers are still being used, and used fairly heavily, but they had broken away from the really just millennia-old tradition of, cavalry sabers being curved blades, so you could kind of slash and continue moving through. There's several cultures, nations, armies, where that was the design. Right around the turn of the 20th century, makers started to actually favor a straight blade. Give you an indication there of the thickness. It's a strong spine there, right? This is, again, if it's a thrusting sword, it's going to need to have some real sturdiness to it. A slashing blade can actually be pretty flexible and kind of wobbly. It'll surprise you when you hold one if you're not familiar with them. But you can see this is almost, that spine is so thick, the back is so thick, you can almost think of it as a really super long spike, right? Like a pyramid that's just drawn out, very, very far out, and with two sides much longer than the other. That's really what it is. So you can see it's all about giving you maximum power and rigidity when thrusting the blade. This is just a great example of like my favorite kind of weapon design. This is absolutely beautiful, but very functional. To look at it, you can tell right away this is meant to be used and to last a long time. I don't like overly kind of frivolous or ostentatious weapons. And here's an up close of the handle, so you can see some of the details, right? There's the rivet going through the tang. It's only got two. That's what holds it in place. And that is the Puerto Seguro Spanish Cavalry Saber. Thanks.